Yeah, so thanks a lot for your introduction, and of course also for the invitation and the opportunity here to talk about 3D reconstruction from images. And yeah, this is motivated for us mainly by the PhenoRob core project 1, which is about in-field 4D crop reconstruction. And that means we want to capture plants on the field with sensor platforms and then in 3D reconstruct them and also model over time how they grow and develop in order to discover new features that may allow us a better understanding of how they actually work and what can we do to make the plants to grow them individually, have higher yields or fewer diseases. And yeah, 3D reconstruction is part of computer vision. Yeah? So we have a 3D scene and we capture the scene through cameras, or we render a model of the scene, and then we have two-dimensional images. And these images are just pixels. Yeah? So how much red, green, and blue we may have at a certain location, they don't actually mean anything. But computer vision now tries to look at this pixel matrix and recover what kind of objects we have in the scene. What is the geometry of the scene? What is the pose of the objects, the shape of the objects, appearance, material properties, and semantics. Many aspects that we want to recover, but unfortunately, computer vision is an ill-posed inverse problem. So many 3D scenes yield the same 2D image, and that means that we need to put in additional constraints, knowledge about the world, in order to resolve these ambiguities. Here is a simple example. If our camera measures this luminance image, then we may perceive edges here, and some edges might be explained by the difference in reflectance, and others might be explained by the difference in shading. And assuming a Lambertian surface where light is reflected in all directions, we can have this very simple model that the luminance is a product of reflectance and shading. But if we have this product, we cannot really say from which component it actually comes. Yeah, so if we have, for example, these two edges here, we may perceive this edge as a reflectance edge and this one as a shading edge. But if we have slightly different perception of geometry, then all of a sudden this edge, which is actually the same one, is a shading edge. And this one is a reflectance edge. So the perceived geometry determines how we perceive shading and reflectance. And if we have an image that we need to explain, then we may come up with very particular solutions. For example, a painter may have a flat canvas and assumes uniform lighting and just paints different reflectances on it. Or a light designer may have a flat canvas of uniform reflectance and throw light on it to produce this image. Or a metal sheet worker may have a very complicated geometry, uniform lighting, the same reflectance overall, and produce our image. But a likely explanation is this one, which is simple and uses prior knowledge about how typical objects are in the world and how light usually comes in the world. So if we have an image to be explained, often we can arrive at different explanations. For example, this one here or this one there, they differ in their geometry and where the light comes from. And usually, for example, we as humans, prefer the interpretation that is consistent with the light from above, because this is usually the case, that light comes from above. If we are talking about computer vision, we need to model image formation. And the simplest camera that we can build is just a little hole and the screen behind that, so that we get an image of the world, which is upside down. And of course, we can model the image plane in front of the focal point, so that it's in the proper direction and both models are equivalent. Unfortunately, if we have just a small hole, our image will be pretty dark. So we can try to make the hole bigger to get a brighter image, but this will become blurry, because now light can travel in many ways. This motivates the use of lenses. Yeah? So with a lens, we can focus the light that comes from a world point and goes through different parts of our opening in the image plane again. But of course, we can model now different effects that are produced by the lenses, like distortions, dark corners, or color aberration. One effect that also now comes into play is limited depth of field. If we have a large opening, then we can focus only a small range of depths, so that objects that are closer or further away from the camera are out of focus. And we can mitigate this effect somewhat by using a smaller aperture again, but this will produce darker images which are more noisy. If we want to use a real camera, we need to convert the image that comes from the real camera towards an image that is modeled by a pinhole camera. So we need to estimate the focal length, we need to estimate where the image center is or possible skew, and we also need to model nonlinear distortions of the lens. Usually this is done by calibration patterns like this checkerboard, and before undistorting images, straight lines may appear curved, and after we estimated the distortion and undistort the image, then we should have straight lines again, as if they would come from a pinhole camera. Image formation, of course, starts from a light source, and then it may hit some surfaces where light is reflected, and then eventually through some optics, hopefully we have a sharp image on our sensor plane. But surfaces have many different properties. Yeah, so this Lambertian reflectance in all direction is nice, but often it also happens that we have specular surfaces where light is preferably reflected in a particular direction, or maybe even surfaces like a mirror. And in general, what happens at a surface is quite complex and can be modeled by a so-called bidirectional reflectance distribution function, where we say at a certain point, we model where the light comes from, in which direction we view it, and then also dependencies on the wavelengths of the light. But not all surfaces are opaque. We may have also transparency or translucency. So light is not just reflected at the surface, but it may be scattered below the surface. It may come out again at the other side of our object or at some other location. So there is really complex interaction between the light and the material that we may need to understand to understand the scene again. 3D reconstruction relies largely on correspondences in images from different viewpoints. So here is some images captured from the PhenoRob experimental field. And we can try to establish correspondences between these images. And if we manage to do that, then we can possibly recover the 3D structure of this scene. But for that, we need to find distinct points which can be matched to other images. And in order to do that, we need so-called interest point detectors. So, for example, this Mexican head Laplacian of Gaussian operator detects blobs, so little areas that are brighter or darker than their surrounding. And we can do that at different scales in order to detect different sizes of these blobs. This is done in a scale space, so we decompose the image into different spatial frequencies and search for local maxima in this contrast, not just in position, but also in scale, so that we have interest points that are localized in the image and in the scale. For each of these interest points that are shown here, we can now describe how locally the image looks like. And the descriptor should summarize the appearance there, but should also be robust to many variations. And the famous scale invariant feature transform proposed by Lowe, DIFT, has the approach to look at the distribution of the local image gradients, of the little edges that we may find and their direction, and builds histograms of these that are around our interest point, such that invariance to shift, scaling, rotation, because these orientations are with respect to the main local image gradient, lighting variations, and viewpoint variations. So the descriptor now is insensitive to all these variations. And if we match descriptors, often we then match points in the world and have, as indicated by the green lines, valid correspondences. Of course, sometimes it fails and we need to filter out these wrong correspondences. If we have such correspondences now, where we have the same world point projected to different cameras, we can span an epipolar plane. Because if we see this world point from one camera, we cannot know how far away it is. And this means that in the other camera, it must be somewhere on this epipolar line. And if we have enough, so at least 8 correspondences, we can recover the so-called essential matrix that describes the relative pose between the cameras. So how much are they shifted and rotated? And this is called extrinsic camera calibration. If we have extrinsic camera calibration, then if we have a point in one camera, we can search for corresponding points just along these epipolar lines and not everywhere in the image. And of course, not always it is the case that we have corresponding points and they correspond to a single point in the world. So we may have 2 rays that actually don't intersect. And of course, the objective now would be to figure out where in the world is our 3D point that we perceive in 2 cameras. And in order to do that, we measure how far away is the projection of our world point from the points that we see in the images and minimize this little red reprojection error. This triangulation works well if we see the same point from quite different perspectives, but there is more and more uncertainty if the perspectives of the cameras are similar. But on the other hand, if we have similar perspectives, then it's easier to establish these correspondences, for example, because there is less occlusion and less viewpoint variation. The famous method of bundle adjustment does this minimization of reprojection error on large scales. So we may have many pictures of scene taken with different cameras from different viewpoints. And our objective now would be to estimate all these camera poses and parameters and recover a 3D point cloud of the scene. And the approach is really just minimization of reprojection errors to overall have a consistent arrangement of cameras and 3D points in the scene. And this optimization problem is highly non-convex. So it is crucial to have a good initialization to not end up in bad local minima. And it's also computationally demanding. So incremental reconstruction methods have been proposed where we extract features, we match features, we try to throw out outliers, and then incrementally estimate where the cameras are, where the 3D points are, include more and more pictures and have a more and more complete reconstruction of the scene. And yeah, this technology is pretty mature at this point. So there are software packages like Colmap or OpenMVS where this can be used. And results are, for example, as here in this famous work of reconstructing Rome in a day. So this is the Colosseum. But so far, we have just a sparse reconstruction based on these interest points of the scene. So we may want to have a dense reconstruction, for example, here in stereo, where we have two images from different viewpoints onto the scene and want to estimate for every point how far away from the camera it is, or what is the disparity between the different cameras. And in order to do that, if we have parallel cameras, we need to search for correspondences just along horizontal lines in the same row. And in order to find such a correspondence, we can analyze how similar these image regions are, and different kinds of error matrix are available to assess how similar or not local blocks are, such that we can find a match here and select the disparity for a pixel. And if we do that, then we may come up with disparity estimates like this. Of course, if you compare that to the ground truth, it's kind of incomplete and noisy. And there is many reasons for that. One of the reasons is that some parts of the image might be visible only from one of the cameras and not from the other one, so that we actually cannot establish good correspondences there. And also assumptions that we make in this method, that we, for example, just need to shift a local window to predict how it looks like from the other camera. This so-called frontoparallel assumption is often invalid. Like when we have disparity, discontinuities like here, then the local patch looks quite different and our assumption is violated. But fortunately, we can incorporate some knowledge about the world. Yeah, for example, that depth varies slowly except at object discontinuities, which are rare and sparse in our image. So we can model this with a Markov random field, where we say, yes, it should correspond to the locally perceived disparity, but neighboring elements should be smooth except for these transitions at object boundaries. And if we have such a model and apply belief propagation, then we can infer depth here and kind of close the gaps. So this might not always be correct, but at least now we have dense depths. And yeah, in recent years, deep learning-based approaches are more and more prominent, and they learn certain statistics about the world and can recover dense depths pretty well. For example, here for this plant image. Using just 2 cameras is good, but if we have more cameras, like in this PhenoRob ground robot, we can view plants from different sides. So at this point, we have 14 of these 45 megapixel cameras, and we can, using ColMap, recover semi-dense point clouds through multi-view stereo. So we know where the cameras are and how they are calibrated, and we can recover a point cloud of the scene. And if we visualize this, then we get results like these. So we have a decent amount of detail, a decent level of detail, and the geometry is also often okay. But as you see, there is also gaps that come, for example, from occlusions or from specular reflections, where the assumptions are violated that this open MVS method actually makes. In recent years, there has been a new approach that is based on novel view synthesis to 3D reconstruction. So the inputs are sparsely sampled images of a scene. The outputs are new views of the same scene. And if we can render new views of the same scene, then we must actually have a good model of the scene. And this approach is based on a neural network. It's a simple neural network that maps spatial location, like in the 3D volume, and from which direction we view that volume element towards color and a density of this representation. Yeah, so how opaque or not is it? And this is actually very similar to traditional ray tracing in graphics. So we shoot a ray, we sample it at some locations, we input that into our neural network that predicts color and how opaque or not this is here. And we can accumulate along a viewing direction all these predictions to render an image from arbitrary viewpoints. This approach is trivially differentiable. So we have a very simple way how we combine these local colors. We have to model how much light is blocked earlier along the ray and how much light is contributed by a certain ray segment. And all this is so simple that it's differentiable. And why is this important? Because now we can formulate a loss here that says the rendered image should look like the image that we actually captured from that viewpoint. So we can minimize this rendering loss and adjust parameters here based on backpropagation. We train this neural network from all the views that we have from the scene. And yeah, there is some little tricks necessary. For example, rendering is not just done uniformly, but we can use these weights to render, to sample more densely where we have contributions towards the image. And the result is now that we can model viewpoint dependent effects, so non-Lambertian materials like here. And if we have the same location viewed from different directions, you see how the color changes. There's another trick that is used, namely positional encoding. So naively, we would get this kind of a result, which is a bit blurry. With this positional encoding, the images look much sharper. So here, this is done just with 2 input dimensions mapped to color. And without positional encoding, you see that there is not much image detail modeled, but this positional encoding takes the coordinates here and maps them to a Fourier space. So we have sines and cosines of these positions with different frequencies, so that the network has an easier job of learning these high resolution details. And then, yeah, the result may look like this. My PhD student, Alex, Radu Alexandru Rosu, who is working in PhenoRob on 3D reconstructions of plants, he developed interesting methods to combine multi-view stereo and novel view synthesis. For example, this one, which will be presented at IJCNN, and where we have different views that are selected close to the target view, and we encode them with a neural encoder to some high-dimensional feature space. We recover depth by predicting where to sample next, and then at each sampled location, we aggregate these features, and this will be done multiple times to recover depths in more and more detail, and then render an image that we compare to the ground truth captured image. This produces not just this novel view color image, but also a depth map. Yeah, so here you see how from the input views that are available from the scene, this method selects the nearby views and is then able to render not just the color, but also depth, and also the uncertainty of this depth estimate. If we have this 3D reconstruction of the scene, we can also supervise method to produce the depths that we actually estimated using ColMap. And then, the produced depth is more consistent. And one can accelerate these methods with so-called instant neural graphics primitives that rely on a hash encoding in order to accelerate this positional encoding. One concept that is also interesting to represent geometry is implicit surface representations, like here in this signed distance function, where on the grid we model the distance to the closest surface. And if we are inside an object, this distance would be negative. So at the zero crossing of this function, we would estimate the surface. And this method actually makes the assumption now that there is a surface, and this is combined with this instant graphics primitives and rendering novel views. And as a result, we now have a more complete and highly detailed model of the plant in form of a mesh that can be rendered in real time using the usual computer graphics approaches. In PhenoRob OpenCall 1, we also have a small project that pursues similar goals, but as a sensor platform, we use small, lightweight commercial drone so that we can capture high resolution images of plants on the field from different viewing directions. And here you see an initial result where of this plant, 200 images have been captured using this flying robot and then accumulated to a model using this instant neural graphics primitives method, where we can render novel views and also render depth maps. And as you see, there is one assumption of the method violated, namely that the plant doesn't move. Yeah? So the plant actually moves, and this means that we need to address this. Yeah? So we need to extend the method in order to also model plant movement. So in conclusion, I think cameras are very interesting because they capture high resolution images, a lot of data of the scene quickly. They are also small and inexpensive, so that we can even have them in a flying robot. But 3D reconstruction from images is an ill-posed inverse problem, and we need to rely on assumptions often, but they may also be violated in real-world scenes, so that we need to incorporate knowledge about the reconstructed objects, how the plants typically look like, how light is usually coming to the scene, and so on, in order to resolve ambiguities. This differentiable volumetric rendering, I think, has very high potential. So there is really in recent years a nerve explosion. So at this year's CVPR, for example, there is more than 50 papers that use this novel method that is just 2-3 years old. Of course, we want to model not only geometry and appearance of the plant, but also the plant structure. Yeah? So like a skeleton, or identify individual plant organs. And not just at one point in time, but we need to model how the plant develops over time, and establish correspondences over time as well. As you can see here in this Pheno4D data set that has been created in the lab with a handheld 3D scanner. So with that, I need to stop and am open for questions.